Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we invite your presence here this morning as we again look at the teaching in the past history of this movement. And we ask, Lord, that your Holy Spirit can guide our minds. We're thankful for each person who has participated in these studies and continues to watch them on YouTube. We just ask, Lord, that they can receive a blessing in understanding these things. And help us, Lord, to sort out truth from error. Help us to understand things clearly so that we can present these things to others. And we thank you for the way that you have led us. We ask for your continued leading. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we're going to be looking at the July 1996 article called The Great Escape. And it's not the greatest picture here. I put this up on the screen. It's just because when I do the videos, it will take a screenshot. It takes 3 different screenshots and one right at the beginning. And I wanted to have this as the title for the video. So that's why I did that. So he's going to continue his study of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. And this is going to be mostly, I think, 41 and 42 that we're going to cover. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. So we know that we look through what the glorious land is, that this is the United States. And so he's going to go through and just expand upon this. And this Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon is an interesting study as well. It's going to relate to how we interpret Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, whether we look at things literally or spiritually. In Daniel 11, verse 40 to 42, there is symbolized within each verse a specific area of conquest for the papacy. In previous articles, we have noted that in verse 40, the Soviet Union is symbolized as the king of the South. And in verse 41, the United States is symbolized as the glorious land. In verse 42, the entire world is symbolized as Egypt, which we will discuss in a future article. The word countries is found in each of these verses, but in 41, it is italicized, thus identifying a word which has been supplied by the translators. In verse 40, the papacy sweeps away the many countries which made up the former Soviet Union. And in verse 42, the papacy brings all the countries of the world under its dominion. But in verse 41, when the papacy enters the glorious land of the United States, many, and he puts here in brackets, people are overthrown, but not many countries. Inadvertently, the translators of the King James Version minimized an important distinction within these verses by their addition of the word countries in verse 41. First, the papacy enters into the countries of the former Soviet Union, and then he enters the United States. Then every country on the globe is brought into subjection. Now, a point that Jeff doesn't notice here, this word many is used by Daniel in other places. So I'm just going to give you a brief study on this word many, because it's a particular Hebrew word. It really means the majority. Or at least a part of something. So it's the word rab by contraction from, that's the number 7227. It's a contraction from 7231, which means abundant in quantity, size, age, number, rank. Can mean often, like a master, a mighty, more, much, multiply, all these different populace. used in process of time. So so it's the word that's used a few times. It's used in verse 41. Many shall be overthrown. It's used in verse 44. He shall utterly make away many. It's used in chapter 12. Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So this word, many shall run to and fro. So we run into this word all the time, many. And the way that I take it in chapter 11 is it means that the majority are the ones who are overthrown. That's the way I understand it. When it says many shall be overthrown, it's the majority. But people could argue with me on that. But that's the way that I look at that. So it's not. It's sort of in contrast to some, to the word some. Some and many. Some is a few, many is a lot more. So anyway, it's just a little note. In Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, we see the papacy marching as it ascends to the throne of the world and ultimately to its final destruction. These verses portray the king of the north moving through a progression of events. In verse 40, he comes against the king of the south. Then he enters the countries. Then he passes over. In verse 41, he enters the glorious land. Then in verse 42, he moves into Egypt. And by verse 43, all the countries are marching with him. In verse 44, he goes forth to destroy, and eventually he plants his tent in verse 45, where he is identified as coming to his end. These unfolding events provide a setting which illustrates the information symbolized within these verses is a progression. The events associated with the approaching Sunday law test, symbolized in verse 41, are also a progressive series of events. So this progression of events, I think, is an important point that he's bringing out. As the papacy spiritually enters the glorious land at the passage of a national Sunday law, those who escape out of his hand are contrasted by those who are overthrown. A division between those who are overthrown and those who escape first takes place among God's people and then progresses into the world. The Sunday law test is the ending of the process of separating of God's people and the beginning of the process of separating the people of the world. The first separation occurs within God's church and determines those who will receive the latter rain from those who will give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. So back in 1996, Jeff obviously hasn't really developed the lines to the point that we had, by at least 2016. I mean, there's quite different lines in a lot of ways. There's a lot more detail there. But this idea of the separation that first happens in the church and then in the world has always been a part of these lines. Just how we have delineated that has changed. 9/11 obviously brought a clear distinction of how these events occurred. So it's an important point. The other thing is when you have those that are overthrown and those that escape out of his hand, we could see that the overthrown would be the majority. Those that escape would be a minority. That's the way that I look at it. So he's not making that distinction of amount, but I think that that's sort of implied because most will be taken by the hand of the papacy.
How would you, I would sort of agree, I would agree that the minority would escape.
Yeah.
But that word many was used in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 or 2.
Yeah.
It says that many shall arise as if from the dead. So, but we would understand that wouldn't be the majority in the sense that would be saved, would be the minority. So how does that word many there in Daniel chapter 12 then?
It's referring to both the righteous and the wicked, right?
Okay, so maybe compared to those who would be resurrected to see those who had pierced Christ would be the minority. And so the majority would be those who would be righteous, would be raised.
Okay, so yeah, I'm reading that verse a little bit differently. So, so when you go to chapter 12 and it says, many of them that sleep, this is verse 2, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. And then it's going to use these words, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So the way that I'm taking this is that the majority of the people are going to be resurrected, right? So there's going to be lots of people resurrected. But then parts of them, that's the word some, are going to receive eternal life, and some are going to receive everlasting contempt, shame and everlasting contempt. So there isn't really great English words to translate these words many and some in from the Hebrew word, right? So this word some is these or those. So that's the word that's translated these or those. So it just means a part or some or thus, or, you know, it has lots of different ways in which it can be translated. So it doesn't really have a good English word. One of the ways is it's sort of assortment. So it's sorting out from another group. That's what the word some means. So you could almost say assortment to everlasting life and an assortment to shame and everlasting contempt, but that would be kind of awkward in English. So it just means that they're chosen out of these, right? Chosen out of a larger group. So you have to look at the context, trying to decide what many is. I'm just saying that many often refers to a majority, right? Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yes, but I wouldn't think of those who would be resurrected at the first resurrection would be a majority of those resurrected. I think the majority would be at the second resurrection.
That's what I'm saying. That this is now contrasting the many to the some. Does that make sense?
Okay, so that many
that many you wouldn't say is the majority. It's the many of a group, right? So you have a group that's a many. So a lot of people are going to be resurrected prior to Christ's second coming. This is the special resurrection, right? It's going to be righteous. So they have to use some in contrast to many, or many in contrast to some, because that's the way that the word many is. It is a contrast word to the word some, because some means a part of something or assortment, but the many is inclusive of a larger group. So that's why I wouldn't say it's the majority in that sense. So there's this majority in the sense of this whole group, and then it's going to be distinguished as to these parts of it. So it's not referring to all those that have died. It's talking to those that are alive. So another way you could translate them, of them that sleep that are resurrection, you have a many, and then you have it divided as to a some that are going to be to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So you're showing that this group is divided into two groups. That's the intent of it.
Okay.
I know it's sometimes difficult when you're translating Hebrew. You have to look at a lot of other verses on how many is used and sort of the context of it. But when it's in contrast with some, as it is here, it's often done that way. But when you have in verse 4, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Again, this is referring to a large group of people at the time of the end. And we know that is many, right? Because it happened all over the world. People are studying the book of Daniel. You have this large movement. You have in the United States 500,000 people who profess to be Millerites out of about 5 million. So in that sense, it's still not necessarily a majority, but it's a very large group. And so my point back in this in Daniel 11 verse 40, when it talks about many shall be overthrown, this is just referring to a very large group. And in this context, it would have to be a majority. And even when you have the word these, that word these, you can actually translate it this way. Many countries shall be overthrown, but some shall escape out of his hand, because that word these is the same word as some. So you can see in the contrast here, you have a many and a some. So the some is the minority, the many is the majority. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's one of those things I struggled with for years, looking at this, trying to understand this in context of Daniel chapter 12, what it was talking about. So that's why I bring it up. Okay, so let's go back here. So when he's talking about this separation, the first separation, so that's one of the things you see. Another way you can look at the many is the sum as a separation of two groups, right? So you have the many, which would be the two groups together. And now you're going to have the sum is the one group taken out of it. But the great issue so near at hand, the Sabbath test, will weed out those whom God has not appointed, and he will have a pure, true, sanctified ministry prepared for the latter rain. Selected Messages, book 3 through 85. I saw that none could share the refreshing unless they obtain a victory over every besetment, over pride, selfishness, love of the world, and over every wrong word and action. We should therefore be drawing nearer and nearer to the Lord, and be earnestly seeking that preparation necessary to enable us to stand in the battle in the day of the Lord. Let all remember that God is holy, and that none but holy beings can ever dwell in his presence. Early writing 71. When the law of God is made void, the church will be sifted by fiery trials, and a larger portion than we now anticipate will give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. Selected Messages, book 2, 368. The second separation begins when God's purified bride begins to call his other sheep out of Babylon. So we can see that there's a separation process going on, and we have a larger proportion, she says, than we now anticipate. But the idea is that this separation is proportioning people out. So when many are overthrown, we would have to say that that's the larger proportion. When those that believe not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness, 2 Thessalonians 2:12, shall be left to receive strong delusion and believe a lie, then the light of truth will shine upon all whose hearts are open to receive it. And all the children of the Lord that remain in Babylon will heed the call, come out of her, my people, Revelation 18:4, which is taken from Maranatha 173. The persecution accompanying the Sunday law test divides God's people into those who receive strong delusions and those who are prepared for the latter rain. In the absence of the persecution, there have drifted into our ranks men who appear sound and their Christianity unquestionable, but who, if persecution should arise, would go out from us. Evangelism 360. As the storm approaches, a large class who have professed faith in the third angel's message, but have not been sanctified through obedience to the truth, abandon their position and join the ranks of the opposition. Great Controversy 608. As the United States will form an alliance with Catholicism in Daniel 11:40, It will cease to uphold the definition and the principles of Protestantism. This change will be a progressive growth leading to a national Sunday law, symbolized by the joining of hands. Beyond the Sunday law, this alliance continues to develop to the point where the United States will force the whole world to make an image to the beast and then ultimately be instrumental in issuing the worldwide death decree. So in 1996, with the fall of the Soviet Union, you can see that Jeff is thinking not very differently from most conservative Adventists. We know that the Sunday law is coming and that it's going to be a progression. And what he's going to spend his time doing once he starts his newsletter, Future News, you're going to see this, that he's going to be keeping track of these events, the connection between Protestantism and the papacy. He's going to be looking at all these events that are happening in the news and trying to track. And this is a very common thing for Adventists to do. We're looking for the Sunday law, and so we're watching, to see how these events are going to unfold. The thing that we'll see once we get there, when 9/11 happens, it's not well understood why it happens at first. That is, in the context of what we're thinking about, we believe that a Sunday law is coming. And this Sunday law had been developing, I believe, prior to 9/11. That 9/11 gave us more time. This is what we came to understand sometime after 9/11, is that Islam's attack on the United States had something to do with it. Now, to understand how the Sunday law develops, I think that's the part that where we missed. We were missing what was happening that was actually a development of the Sunday law. That is, we thought of it as an act of governments and churches getting together, making these plans. But I think that the plans for the Sunday law go much deeper into the intellectual philosophy that's being taught at universities, that you could see that what was being taught, what was being prepared, there's a preparation for the Sunday law, was the minds of our youth at that time. So there's a lot more to it than we tend to think. Now, I was going to go on here. How the Roman Church can clear herself from the charge.
Wasn't it Hitler that said if he could get the minds of the youth for one generation?
Yeah, I don't know if it's Hitler that said that or not, but I know that is a quote. I think it precedes Hitler, but he might have said it.
It precedes Hitler by quite a bit.
Yeah, because I think it's a Jesuit saying, isn't it?
It is a Jesuit saying, because the Jesuits have often said, if you give us a child until he is 7 years old, he will be a Catholic for life.
Yeah, that's the quote I know. But Hitler might have repeated it, or people might have put those words into Hitler's mouth later. But yeah, it's a Jesuit teaching. Okay, how the Roman Church can clear herself from the charge of idolatry, we cannot see. And this is the religion which Protestants are beginning to look upon with so much favor, and which will eventually be united with Protestantism. Now, and just think about this, eventually be united. Now, we're going to have a quote here coming up that's very fascinating. But this, you being united, what we have looked at, when I was younger and my dad was following the ecumenical movement, ecumenism at that time really was just people trying to find things in common, basically the lowest common denominator of belief, so that they could try to work together. Now, in some ways, that's not really true unity. That's it's the type of unity which church doctrines or statements of beliefs are written. They're written in a way that people who actually are not united can agree upon. Now, those types of things do lead to cutting, they lead to bringing about a type of unity. But I think this eventually be united with Protestantism. Protestantism has to change enough so that Protestants think just like Catholics. So she's going to say this is the quote that I'm talking about. This union will not, however, be affected by a change in Catholicism. So when you have this ecumenism going on and you find this common belief, Catholicism wasn't going to change. What was going to change was Protestantism. For Rome never changes. She claims infallibility. It is Protestantism that will change. And here's what she says. This sentence I find very interesting. The adoption of liberal ideas on its part, that is on the part of Protestantism, will bring it where it can clasp the hand of Catholicism. So what was it that the Omega was saying regarding liberal and conservative? If anybody remembers.
Conservatism is bad.
Yeah, conservatism is bad, and it's good to be liberal. Now, we're using them in the small c sense, right? So what is a conservative? What does it mean to be a conservative? Just think of the root of the word.
You're restraining, you're kind of not moving, you're kind of rigid.
You're conserving things, right? So that means you're keeping things the same, right? Yeah, so there's a restriction, now I'm naturally a conservative. That is, I'm very frugal with money. I don't like change. I'm not the type of person who would ever have gotten a tattoo. I never smoked drugs or drank alcohol. I was just naturally conservative in how I dealt with myself. I was always very liberal with others. So I was raised to be a liberal in the sense that allowed other people freedom. So freedoms that I wouldn't have given myself. So liberal has to do with freedom. Liberty is related to freedom. So you have one that's sort of a constraint and the other that's a freedom, right? Now, when it comes to liberal ideas, what is she talking about? Liberal ideas. How did Protestant have liberal ideas on its part? It adopts liberal ideas. What would those liberal ideas be?
Sort of open to other ideas, theologies, understanding of scripture.
Yeah. So the United Church of Canada, which I grew up in, was a liberal church. That is, it wasn't conserving its beliefs or its doctrines. It was readily changing them, and so it was trying to be hip and happening with the times, right? It wasn't trying. It thought that if it is liberal, that it can keep the youth and it's going to move along with the times. So the Jesus of the past is not the Jesus of today. That's one of the things we learned in the United Church, is that Jesus changes or God changes. So they would have the idea that Jesus is a liberal, because a liberal would refer to change. So when we see these liberal ideas, it's not necessarily a political term, but it is connected. So we could see that the Omega, in their liberality or their liberal ideas, were not willing to hold on to the old landmarks. They weren't willing to preserve. And so they would look at conservative as a bad thing. And Ellen White does talk about conservative as being a bad thing in a certain context. And what would the context that conservative would be a bad thing? Why would it be bad to be a conservative? Where would it be bad?
In a kind of resistance to all change.
Yeah, a resistance to all change and a resistance to change from going from error to truth, right? So if you're conservative and you're going to hold on to error and you're not going to be open to new light, that would be a bad way to be conservative.
Yeah.
But if you're holding on to truth, that's a good way to be a conservative. So, and I don't think it's just about a balance between liberal and conservative. I think it's about a distinction of where particularly, or what types of things you are particularly being liberal about, and what types of things you are being conservative about. So you need to be conservative when it comes to the truth. You need to be able to recognize what truth is. A little saying that I like is, I'm open-minded, but not so open-minded that my brains fall out. And this to me illustrates this idea. I need to be aware that there are things I do not know, that truth and that new light lies outside of my present thinking. But I'm not going to just accept anything that I hear just because it sounds good. I'm going to examine things. So what has happened to Christianity, to Protestantism, is that it has adopted liberal ideas. And these liberal ideas have permeated our society. And we can see this, it just really exploded over the last few years with, homosexuality, transgenderism, Black Lives Matter, all these crazy things that have happened. These would be liberal ideas and these would be bad things. But the new movement has adopted these liberal ideas because they misused a quote in the Spirit of Prophecy regarding conservative, and they weren't willing to look and examine at what Ellen White was actually talking about. So this statement here from the Review and Herald, June 1st, 1886, I believe it was in April of 1886. Might have been earlier. Maybe it was the previous year. But anyway, this article that's published in the Review and Herald, Ellen White, it's from a talk that she did when she was in the Waldensian Valley there, where they had the Italian camp meetings. So I found that kind of interesting. So that's why she's talking about Catholicism here, because she's going over the past history of the Waldenses in her talk. So it's a pretty interesting article. You can look that up. And I'm just going to see if I have that quote. No. Where it is. Yeah, this was 1886. In April 15th, they had arrived in this part of Italy. She talks about what it was like and so forth. So it's a good article to read.
What book was that in?
It's Review and Herald,
Okay.
June 1st, 1886. Before the Sunday law is strictly enforced, as the United States moves closer to Catholicism and farther from her Protestant heritage, the divine protection which the principles of Protestantism have secured for this nation will begin to be withdrawn. This withdrawal of divine favor brings calamities and troubles in proportion to the lessening distance between the United States and Catholicism. These troubles continue or contribute to the initial persecution, which in turn contributes to the division of God's people. So Jeff is making this statement here from his perspective. Before the Sunday law is strictly enforced, there's going to be this change that's going to happen in the United States. And because of that change, we're going to see calamities. Now, I think to some degree he's misplacing this because he's taking some ideas in the Spirit of Prophecy. But because we don't have the details yet, and I'm not saying that calamities haven't happened or aren't coming because of that, but there's still a part that he's missing. that we just didn't realize at that time. It will be declared that men are offending God by the violation of the Sunday Sabbath, that this sin has brought calamities which will not cease until Sunday observance shall be strictly enforced. So this idea, we're very familiar, we should be, as conservative Adventists. And that's why when we look at these calamities that are happening, earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, etc., we know that they're going to get worse and worse, and that at some point, the reason given for Sunday observance is that these calamities are coming upon us because we're not keeping the Sunday Sabbath. Now, the problem with this, and I'm not saying that Ellen White's wrong, but the problem is that we have, I believe, sort of misplaced where this is. That is, this is after a certain point that we're trying to place it too early. And I would place this to a large degree during the time of the plagues, dealing with the death decree that's going to come. So I wouldn't place it into the context of the national Sunday law that initially comes. But that's just my opinion here. So, it's something we have to discuss. And that those who present the claims of the fourth commandment, thus destroying the reverence for Sunday, are troublers of the people, preventing their restoration to divine favor and temporal prosperity. So this has to be at a point where temporal prosperity has disappeared. So it's going to need to be restored. So it's a context that's later on. Thus the accusation urged of old against the servant of God will be repeated, and upon grounds equally well established. Great Controversy 590. The people of this land will desire a restoration to divine favor and temporal prosperity. Their desire for a return to prosperity indicates the economic distress precedes the Sunday law. So the question is, which Sunday law are you talking about? And I think here in the context here, he's looking at it as the Sunday law, the initial Sunday law in the United States. And so this is something that's been discussed in this movement, national apostasies followed by national ruin. Well, if we look at that in that context, the national ruin is when the prosperity disappears. And I think it would be this Sunday law that would be in response to this loss of temporal prosperity, because they're going to want it destroyed. Right now, we have temporal prosperity. We may not think it's that great, but compared to what things have been, the world's actually in pretty good shape financially. The very means that is now so sparingly invested in the cause of God, that is selfishly retained, will in a little while be cast with all idols to the moles and to the bats. Money will soon depreciate in value very suddenly when the reality of eternal scenes opens to the senses of men. A pretty interesting comment by Sister White. Money will soon depreciate in value very suddenly. And this, of course, will happen. Something that happens every time a society falls apart and you really have money just loses its value. Increasing economic instability with escalating calamities will contribute to the demand for Sunday observance, while also accelerating the persecution of God's people, thus further dividing God's people. Our work of warning will then be restricted by persecution, economic trials, increasing calamities, and apostasy from our ranks. The work which the church has failed to do in a time of peace and prosperity, she will have to do in a terrible crisis. Under most discouraging, forbidding circumstances, the warnings that worldly conformity has silenced or withheld must be given under the fiercest opposition from the enemies of the faith. And at that time, the superficial conservative class, whose influence has steadily retarded the progress of the work, will renounce the faith and take their stand with its avowed enemies, toward whom their sympathies have long been tending. So here's where we have this conservative class. So what is the context at that time? The superficial conservative class, whose influence has steadily retarded the progress of the work. Why is she talking about conservative here? Because I think this is one of the main statements that people use, that the Omega used regarding conservative. So we've seen her use the word liberal, and now we see her use the word conservative. So what is she talking about of this superficial conservative class?
It's nice that she added that descriptive term, superficial.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So this is superficial conservatives. It's the superficial. This is not really talking about true conservatives. These are people that are holding on to a form, but not to the substance of truth. Would you agree with me on that?
Now, this is something we've been decrying in the Adventist Church forever.
Okay, can you explain?
You know, the superficial members who just come for the loaves and fishes and potlucks and don't really have any interest in spreading the word
Right.
or maintaining purity of faith.
Yeah. So, I mean, as an outsider from Adventism, when I became an Adventist, I would say that Adventists were not very Adventist, right? So, I'd be reading the Spirit of Prophecy and looking at Adventism and saying, well, these people are just culturally Adventists. And they always try to look somewhat conservative, at least superficially, right? So they're going to dress a certain way. And, back in the 80s, that's the way it would be. Adventists definitely looked distinct from the world. But as time went on, Adventists looked more and more like the world. They just seemed to always be a little bit behind the times, always a little bit square. But, and that's kind of how I look at Adventism, is they really were just trying to hold on to the form of godliness, but denying the power of God. So they weren't really Adventists, in my view. But, that's me as a human being looking at other people. There's obviously lots of Adventists that were interested in the truth, but many weren't. So
I first ran into the concept of cultural religionists in reference to the Jews in Israel, who were not what we would say is conscientious Sabbath keepers, and that eventually the Jews in Israel would flip to keeping Sunday.
Yeah.
Because they were just cultural Jews.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a Review and Herald, or Adventist Review, I guess, issue back in the 90s, I believe it was, late 90s. I don't think it was into the 2000s yet, but and it was the whole issue was looking at churches, Adventist churches throughout all the world, and how that we were all culturally Adventist. And there was one article in particular where this lady had written, where she didn't even really believe in God. She didn't really believe in Adventism, but she was a cultural Adventist. And this was seen as a good thing, that we could just culturally be Adventist. This would be like somebody being, Catholic, but not really believing in Catholicism, but, you're going to go to church at Easter and Christmas, that type of thing. And so there was this whole thing about cultural Adventism. And to me, the root of culture is cult. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. You're just joining a group, for social reasons. But anyway, Ellen White says here, and at that time, the superficial conservative class, whose influence has steadily retarded the progress of the work, will renounce the faith and take their stand with its avowed enemies, toward whom their sympathies have long been tending. Right. And this is what we see in Adventism. This is what we see in Christianity. This is what we see in the world. And, with the events that have unfolded again over the last few months, we can definitely see, that there's been this change in the world, and the church is not far behind, if not in some ways leading in this. This separation process is called the shaking. The shaking finishes its work for God's people soon after the passage of the National Sunday Law in the United States, and then it proceeds to the inhabitants of the world. The Sunday Law is the finish line for those who profess to be Seventh-day Adventists, but it is also the starting line for the shaking to move from Adventism to the world. So it's just another way of saying that the Sunday Law is the close of probation for Seventh-day Adventists. But it's a nice illustration of this finish line and this starting line. The issue of Sabbath Sunday sacredness will form the final dividing line between the obedient and the disobedient in this world. So that's something that we well know as Seventh-day Adventists. So he gives an Ellen White quote here: "The Sabbath will be the great test of loyalty, for it is the point of truth especially controverted, when the final test shall be brought to bear upon men. Then the line of distinction will be drawn between those who serve God and those who serve him not. While the observance of the false Sabbath in compliance with the law of the state, contrary to the fourth commandment, will be an avowal of allegiance to a power that is in opposition to God, the keeping of the true Sabbath in obedience to God's law is an evidence of loyalty to the Creator. While one class, by accepting the sign of submission to earthly powers, receive the mark of the beast, the other, choosing the token of allegiance to divine authority, receive the seal of God." The Great Controversy 605. So just pretty standard Adventism, nothing really there that we would see as unique to what Jeff is teaching. He's teaching what Adventists have believed for a long time, though the church has departed from that view since 1996. As persecution increases, those who have only professed the truth, yet not experienced it, will continue to flee the ranks of Adventism. At that time, those who have not only professed but also experienced the truth will become more zealous in proportion to the apostasy in the world and in the church. Now, again, when we look at this persecution, what is this persecution referring to in this history? I don't know. I think that he's sort of seen this persecution as kind of preceding the Sunday Law to some degree, like the National Sunday Law, the first Sunday Law, really. But I think to a large degree it happens after. So I think he's not clearly defining these waymarks. He's just kind of blending them all together, which is how we would have done it in 1996. We're not close to the picture yet. We don't see the fine distinction of the progression of events. We just kind of group them together. When the law of God is being made void, when his name is dishonored, when it is considered disloyal to the laws of the land to keep the seventh day as the Sabbath, when wolves in sheep's clothing, through blindness of mind and hardness of heart, are seeking to compel the conscience, shall we give up our loyalty to God? No, no. The wrongdoer is filled with a satanic hatred against those who are loyal to the commandments of God. But the value of God's law as a rule of conduct must be made manifest. The zeal of those who obey the Lord will be increased as the world and the church unite in making void the law. They will say with the psalmist, "I love thy commandments above gold, yea, above fine gold." Psalm 119, verse 127. This is what will be sure to occur when the law of God is made void by a national act. When Sunday is exalted and sustained by law, then the principle that actuates the people of God will be made manifest. So it's going to be clear that this test will show who is standing with God and who is not. As the principle of the three Hebrews was made manifest, when Nebuchadnezzar commanded them to worship the golden image in the plain of Dura, we can see what our duty is when the truth is overborne by falsehood. Manuscript Releases, Volume 13, page 71. The time of destructive judgments. So I was going to give some Spirit of Prophecy quotes here, a few in a row. right after he makes the statement here. Okay, the division of God's people who escape the king of the north and those who are overthrown by him reaches its climax when the law of God is made void in a special sense. So, so what that special sense is he'll sort of bring this out. This act of national apostasy is followed by national ruin as God's destructive judgments are poured out. A time is coming when the law of God is, in a special sense, to be made void in our land. So, trying to understand in a special sense. The rulers of our nation will, by legislative enactments, enforce the Sunday law, and thus God's people be brought into great peril. When our nation, in its legislative councils, shall enact laws to bind the consciences of men in regard to their religious privileges, enforcing Sunday observance, and bringing oppressive power to bear against those who keep the seventh-day Sabbath, the law of God will, to all intents and purposes, be made void in our land, and national apostasy will be followed by national ruin. That's Review and Herald, December 1888. So, so what is this in a special sense about? So when it says, the time is coming when the law of God is, in a special sense, to be made void in our land. What is she talking about as this in a special sense? Why does she use this term? What is she defining?
Has to be more overt than in the past.
Yeah, it's not just people disobeying the Sabbath. There has to be this legislative act enforcing Sunday and persecuting those who are keeping the Sabbath, right? Those two things go hand in hand. So that's when she says that the law of God is made void in our land. That's the special sense she's talking about. Protestants will work upon the rulers of the land to make laws to restore the lost ascendancy of the man of sin who sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Roman Catholic principles will be taken under the care and protection of the state. This national apostasy will speedily be followed by national ruin. The protest of Bible truth will be no longer tolerated by those who have not made the law of God their rule of life. So this is a very particular point in which the law of God is made void. When the Sunday law is enforced, national ruin will follow speedily upon its heels. This time of destructive judgments will be the time when probation will close for Seventh-day Adventists in the United States. Many who have known the truth have corrupted their way before God and have departed from the faith. The broken ranks will be filled up by those represented by Christ as coming in at the 11th hour. There are many with whom the Spirit of God is striving. The time of God's destructive judgments is the time of mercy for those who have had no opportunity to learn what is truth. Tenderly will the Lord look upon them. His heart of mercy is touched. His hand is still stretched out to save, while the door is closed to those who would not enter. Large numbers will be admitted who in these last days hear the truth for the first time. So the door is still going to be open to those who have not heard the truth, but it will be closed to those who had rejected the truth. Those in Babylon with whom the Spirit of God is striving will respond to the loud cry message and replace the Adventists who corrupted their way before God. For those who have corrupted their way, the time of national ruin will be the time of God's destructive judgments. While for those who have had no opportunity to learn what is truth, it will be a time of mercy. So this is where the finish line and the starting line that he talked about is illustrated. The time of mercy and the time of judgment are determined by our personal response to the light which has been made available to us. What might they have done? Seventh-day Adventists, more than any other people, will have no excuse for not upholding the Sabbath when the Sunday law is enforced. For we have not simply judged by what excuse me here. So, for we are not simply judged by what we know, but also by what we could have known had we availed ourselves of every opportunity for enlightenment. The punishment of those who have had abundant opportunity to know the truth, but who in blindness and unbelief have contended against God and his messengers, will be proportionate to the light they have rejected. God greatly favored them, giving them peculiar advantages and gifts, that they might let their light shine forth to others. But in their perversity, they led others astray. God will judge them for the good they might have done, but did not. He will call them to account for their misused opportunities. They turn from God's way to their own way, and they will be judged. They will be judged according to their works. By walking contrary to the principles of truth, they greatly dishonored God. They became fools in his sight by turning his truth into a lie, as they have been distinguished by the mercies bestowed on them, so that they will be distinguished by the severity of their punishment. Review and Herald, June 25th, 1901. As the issue moves through Adventism into the world, the same testing requirements will be used upon those in the world as was used upon Adventists. The test will be determined on how we respond to truth once we are informed of the issues. The reception of the mark of the beast requires an informed choice regarding God's Sabbath. He says, see the Great Controversy 449. None will receive the mark of the beast until the issue is thus plainly set before them. This issue had been plainly set before Seventh-day Adventists long before the Sunday law. They have been enlightened concerning the obligation of the true Sabbath, and for them to then transgress the command of God and obey a precept which has no higher authority than that of Rome is to acknowledge the supremacy of the papacy, receive the mark of the beast, and close their probationary time. In verse 41, so now he's going to go to those that escape. We see those who escape out of his hand. In this phrase, the word hand is a prophetic symbol which portrays the power and authority exercised by a conqueror. So he had talked about this in the preceding article, that he was going to do the study on the word hand. And so he's going to show us some verses here. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will give Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, into the hand of his enemies, and into the hand of them that seek his life, as I gave Zedekiah, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, his enemy, and that sought his life. So that's from Jeremiah 44:30. And he says, see Zechariah 11, verse 6. When the king of the north enters the glorious land, there are some who escape his hand, and some who are overthrown. The word hand is used to represent the power and authority exercised by the papacy when it enters the United States and overthrows many. The authority of the papacy is Sunday observance. As the sign of the authority of the Catholic Church, papist writers cite the very act of changing the Sabbath into the Sunday, which Protestants allow of, because by keeping Sunday, they acknowledge the Church's power to ordain feasts and to command them under I lost my place. Trying to flip through this here. Under sin. Okay, so that's Henry Tuberville, An Abridgment of the Christian Doctrine, page 58. What then is the change of the Sabbath but the sign or mark of the authority of the Roman Church, the mark of the beast, the Great Controversy 448. The sign or seal of God is revealed in the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, the Lord's memorial of creation. The mark of the beast is the opposite of this, the observance of the first day of the week, This mark distinguishes those who acknowledge the supremacy of the papal authority from those who acknowledge the authority of God. Angela says Zechariah 11:6 describes fratricidal war. When Daniel 11:41 is understood in this context, Daniel's use of the word hand represents the assumption of spiritual authority in the United States by the papacy at the passage of the Sunday law. John's testimony in Revelation 13:16 that all should receive the mark in their right hand also uses the hand to identify the mark of the papacy's authority. The enforcement of the Sunday law is symbolized by the United States coming into the hand of the papacy in Daniel 11:41. It is at the passage of the Sunday law that those who escape his grasp that those who escape will escape his grasp, for until then it is not a legal issue. What is he saying here regarding this hand? Especially this last sentence. It is at the passage of the Sunday law that those who escape will escape his grasp, for until then it is not a legal issue. So is he saying that when it becomes a legal issue, that's when the hand comes into play? Is that how you understand it? That the hand
issue or legal enactment.
Yeah. So when the Sunday law comes to pass, then that's when the hand of the papacy is there for people to escape from, but not before. Right. That's the way I'm taking it. I think I'm understanding it correctly. Yeah, because it has to be a legal inaction. When Protestantism clasps the hands of Catholicism, it is in reality a subjugation of the spiritual authority of the papacy. The symbolic use of
the spiritual authority of the papacy.
Yeah. What's that?
You said of the spiritual authority and to the spiritual authority.
To the spiritual authority of the papacy. The symbolic use of the word hand and the movement or march of the King of the North are also used by the spirit of prophecy when addressing these identical issues and time periods. So he says, notice how the word hand is used. When our nation shall abjure the principles of its government as to enact a Sunday law, Protestantism will in this act join hands with popery. So he's saying here that hands have to do with authority. It's not just, like kids joining hands in playing a game like, I can't remember what the game's called. It's not, this is actually about authority. That's what this hand is. That's the way that Jeff is describing this. By the decree enforcing the institution of the papacy, in violation of the law of God, our nation will disconnect herself fully from righteousness. When Protestantism shall stretch her hand across the gulf to grasp the hand of the Roman power, when she shall reach over the abyss to clasp hands with spiritualism, when, under the influence of this threefold union, our country shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and shall make provision for the propagation of papal falsehoods and delusions, then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan, and that the end is near. Testimonies, Volume 5, 451. Now, let's have a little bit of a discussion regarding this. So how have we understood this threefold union? How does this come to pass in the eyes of conservative Adventists over the last 30, 40 years, as we've been looking at the events that led up to the fall of the Soviet Union and afterwards? So what did we see was happening? what does it mean? Protestantism shall stretch her hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of the Roman power.
Well, we pinned that on 1989, the United States cooperating with papacy to cast down the USSR.
Yeah. So, and before that, so we saw, you know, the United States had an ambassador to the Vatican. We were looking at Seventh-day Adventists, at least, you know, in the 80s, the early 80s. You're looking at these events that happened, especially once you got Pope John Paul II becoming Pope, you know, which is like early 80s. Can't remember exactly the date, 81 or 80. So you have Pope John Paul, and then you have Ronald Reagan, and they're working together. Now, some of the things happening behind the scenes we didn't know about at the time, but you could definitely see that Reagan had warmed up to the papacy, that they had a common goal. Now, so then when we look at she shall reach over the abyss to clasp the hands of spiritualism. Who would we define as spiritualism prior to 1989? What would Seventh-day Adventists in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 60s, what would we see as spiritualism? If anybody can remember back then.
I would suggest occult things like seances, those who would be involved in such things.
Yeah, so we would look at the occult. Now, of course, we know that's connected with atheism, as much as it doesn't really make much sense, because you think atheism is a rejection of the supernatural, but really atheism isn't. It's really a type of spiritualism. But if we were going to look at a power, who that would be, who were they going to? At least this is the way that I looked at it back when I first became an Adventist. If we're going to look at a power, so this was prior to me studying Lewis F. Weir, and probably reading some other Adventist authors. How did they see, and some of you may not remember this because you're not old enough, but if we can think back, who would be the spiritualistic power that you would have to reach across the abyss to clasp the hands of? Because you have Protestantism, United States, grasping the hand of the Roman power. So who would then be this spiritualistic power? This wasn't necessarily the view of everyone, but it was a view that existed within Adventism. So which nation represented spiritualism? Okay, so Pope John Paul II came to power mid-October 78. That makes sense. And I should have known that because that's when I bought that book, The Final Conclave. Okay, so anyway, the question is, who is spiritualism to an Adventist in the 1970s and early 1980s?
As a nation, I'm thinking, I'm probably wrong, but like Haiti would be into like voodoo stuff. And
okay, see, so that's not the view that was held. The view that was held is that it was Russia, the USSR. So there was this view held in Adventism. I'm not saying it was the majority view, but it was a common view that that the threefold union was communism, the United States, and Catholicism. Now, we take the position, what is the power that represents spiritualism to us now?
United Nations.
United Nations. But that wasn't really the view that I heard when I became an Adventist. Now, there wasn't much talk about the United Nations. Now, maybe there was in different groups, but from the exposure that I had, spiritualism would have been atheism, and it would have been the USSR. So the idea that it's the United Nations was really not an idea that I grasped, not to as a connection with this, but I didn't understand until I came into this movement. So for a long time, I was uncertain, because initially I thought it was the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, I was uncertain as to what power this could be, what it meant that the Protestantism would reach over the abyss to clasp the hands with spiritualism. And so this threefold union kind of puzzled me. Now, this threefold union, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, the city of Babylon, the way that it was understood. And I think it was Roy Allen Anderson, maybe that was the book I read, that influenced me in that direction, which he was way off track. But I think it was that book where he sort of looked at it more as communism, but I could be wrong. It could have been something else I read. Now, what would we see now? So we know that this is the UN, and how would we describe the UN now? In this context of this discussion, the threefold union.
The dragon power.
Yeah, it's
The dragon.
global atheism now.
Global atheism.
The dragon power.
So it's connected with Satan. So that makes much more sense than the idea that it's just communism. But you can see that in some ways there is a similarity, and that common thread has to do with the atheism. So when the Soviet Union fell in 1989, it wasn't the end of spiritualism. In some ways, spiritualism was embodied in the USSR, but the USSR as a nation had to fall in order for Protestants to clasp hands with spiritualism. The USSR had to fall, and in the fall of the USSR, it was a conquering of what? What was conquered when the USSR fell? Just think about the word hands here that Jeff is using, because I don't think he realizes what he's saying, or what's being implied here.
Are you thinking of they're actually grasping the philosophy of communism?
Yeah.
And taking that on board?
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. And this goes along with what we've been studying over the last week in seeing this. Because when the USSR fell, so in some ways, I think it was correct to identify atheism in the USSR, and maybe even you could have included China in that. These atheistic powers would be this spiritualism. And we saw this with the Soviet Union. It had a real interest in what we call, extrasensory perception. They did lots of scientific investigation into things that would not be mainstream science, like mind reading and bending spoons and stuff with your mind and telekinesis and all that stuff. The USSR did a lot of scientific, in quotation marks, research in that area. Because once you have abandoned God, you don't necessarily abandon superstition. In a lot of ways, scientism is just another brand of superstition. Naturalism is a brand of superstition, dressed up in scientific garb. So anyway, the point is that in order for the philosophy of atheism to make its inroads into Protestantism, it was necessary that the US and the Pope stretched their hands across the gulf, or they reached across to each other. And then, in doing so, that was the fall of the Soviet Union, resulted from that. But then they will reach their hand over the abyss to clasp the hands with spiritualism. So we don't see the fall of the Soviet Union as reaching over the abyss to clasp the hands of spiritualism. The first has to fall before that happens. Right, so everything that's talked about, this repudiation of every principle of the Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, occurs after these two things occur. And I think that that's what we're seeing. So what we have seen is the events leading to the Sunday law have to do with this clasping the hands of spiritualism, or globalism, as we would now place it. So again, the question, does the fall of the Soviet Union, this flood that comes up even unto the neck, is the head again, this spiritualism, atheism, rather than Russia itself? And that's something that we're still examining. It is Protestantism that will change. The adoption of liberal ideas on its part will bring it where it can clasp the hand of Catholicism. So Jeff brings us back to this statement from the Review and Herald. And so again, what we have seen is the adoption of liberal ideas on the part of Protestantism, not just on the part of the American government. So has Protestantism adopted liberal ideas where it very nearly thinks the same as Catholicism? That's the question.
Oh, yes, we can see it plainly by now.
Yeah, and it's not just that, Democrats, some kind of political group has adopted liberal ideas. Christianity has. And this has happened very, very rapidly. Now, I can think back about 20 years ago. I remember when I opened my guitar store, I'd hired this guy to work for me teaching guitar, and his dad was some kind of evangelical minister that believed in universalism. And this young guy, he would have been 18, I think, maybe, when I hired him. For a short while. He was into the modern Christian music, contemporary Christian music. And contemporary Christian music that he was listening to was pretty much really, really bad pop music of sorts. I mean, there's a lot of, it was even had rap mixed in with it. And but it was very, very liberal, not just in the sense of the music being liberal, but the ideas in the music was extremely liberal. And, you just think, well, that's just the young people, right? But those young people grew up and their ideas still stuck with them, all of these ideas. So, 10 years later, there was a church that opened up in Leduc, called City Church or City Life, something like that. City Life Fellowship or something like that. I can't remember the exact name. It's still there. And it's one of those warehouse type churches, right? So they don't build like a church building. They just rent a warehouse and they have their church. And another guy who worked for me, he went to this church, and a lot of those people, they would come and buy guitars from us and amps. And, their worship service was basically a rock concert. Of course, we're all familiar with these ideas. But also, the one guy there said, there's just very common for the people to sleep around. And this was just a part, so there wasn't really much there that you would call Christianity. So this is the Protestantism that has changed. And I think that we could say it's the superficial conservatives, both within Adventism and also within the world, who sort of try to hold on to things that they call Christianity. But in their practice, in their life, in their beliefs, they really do not differ from the world. And how we ended up with, because the way the media portrays it is it's all these Christians who supported Trump. But we have to know that in order for Biden to win, a lot of Christians voted for Biden, right? It wasn't just a few. Americans pretty much a Christian nation. And a lot of people who voted for Trump wouldn't even consider themselves Christian. They're just conservatives who didn't like what was happening. So I think this change in Protestantism has happened, and that this grasping of Catholicism definitely has occurred with the Protestant world. But I think we can also see that this grasping of the hand of spiritualism has also occurred, or is at least occurring, in what is happening presently. The Protestants of the United States will be foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. So listen to that again. The Protestants of the United States will be foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hands of spiritualism. They will reach over the abyss to clasp the hands with the Roman power. And under the influence of this threefold union, this country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling the rights of conscience. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Amos 3:3. Not only does Sister White apply the hand as a symbol of when the authority of Rome is sustained in the United States by the enforcement of the National Sunday Law, but she also portrays the papacy at this time in history as on a spiritual conquest. Daniel describes the King of the North marching through the Soviet Union, then into the United States, and then into the world, the entire world. Sister White also portrays these scenes as a march when she states, "This country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience." So we have a few minutes left. Does anybody have some thoughts about what we have just read? Because we're having this discussion regarding spiritualism.
Times have certainly changed since then.
Yeah. 1996 is a lot different than 2021 as far as what we see happening. And if you took somebody from 1996, imagine this, and you just, you woke him up from, he was in a coma since 1996, and you showed him what's on the news. I think that he would be extremely amazed as what is happening in the world.
Freedom of speech is already almost gone.
Yeah. And it's happened in a way that, none of us could have anticipated this. There's a meme on Facebook, something where, to the effect, basically that liberals, they're obviously against certain things. I can't remember how the meme goes. I can't remember the first part of it. But the thing is, liberals did not really expect, because they're against the institutions, right? Republicans run everything. That was the way. They're against republicanism or conservatism or whatever. And so they were opposed to, the establishment at one time. But now liberals run everything. They run the corporations, they run big tech, they run the media. So now liberals can't stand in opposition to the hierarchy, right? So another way to look at it is the hierarchy. You have conservative and liberals. Here's another ways in which conservatives and liberals are described. Conservatives believe in hierarchies in a good sense, that you need people who are competent running things. And liberals, one of the purpose of liberals is to oppose tyranny, right? So you have hierarchies which can tend towards tyranny. And a liberal is somebody who wants change. And when things get bad, things get tyrannical, they would step in and oppose the hierarchy. But a conservative would tend towards supporting the hierarchy, supporting the organizational structure of competence. But when things get out of hand, it's up to the liberals to come in and change things. But what do you do when the tyranny is one that's controlled by liberals and liberals are supporting it? And that seems to be the situation that we have today.
That's when you get a revolution.
Right. And yeah, so a revolution, and we don't really have time to talk about it, but I've been studying a bit about revolution and how they come about. But basically the idea is that you have a hierarchy, and that hierarchy functions properly when competence is rewarded. But when you have incompetence rewarded, that was when you have people who are not the best in charge and they create a tyranny, then they oppress those below them. And then it creates a situation where the structure cannot stand. And that's what we see happening in the United States as well. So you see incompetence. You have people like AOC as, a senator or whatever she is. She's not a senator. She's a
Representative.
representative. Yeah, she's a representative, House of Representatives. Somebody who thinks that the word surge is a military term, and that when you talk about the surge at the border, you're calling children insurgents. So when you have somebody who's that uneducated and really dim-witted as a representative, you have people who are untalented and unskilled leading the country, then you have a real problem. And she's just an easy target. But a lot of these people are really incompetent people and just self-seeking. So, the United States is in bad shape right now. And so what we see happening, I think you can take what Jeff has written here and apply it, even though he wouldn't have seen it back in 1996. So if there's no other comments.
We're trampling on the rights of conscience in all kinds of secular ways.
Yeah, and trampling on the rights of conscience is not a good thing.
Thinking his last line.
Yeah. Okay, so let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for this time that we had to examine here this morning. We ask that these things that we have examined, we can understand them, that we can continue to study them. We pray for the rest of this week in our study personally, in our group study. We ask, Lord, that you can help us to clarify these things. We pray for each person who is studying, that you can enlighten their minds. We pray, Lord, for our church, this people in this movement. We know that the final events will be rapid ones, and they appear to be very rapid presently. But we know, Lord, that we have to be ready for these events that are coming upon the world, and we feel unready. Help us, Lord, to prepare. Help us to study, to be obedient, to follow and serve you. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks.